All right, let's dive into a skill that can honestly make or break any academic paper: how to weave secondary sources into your writing. We're going to learn how to go from just having a list of quotes to building a really powerful, polished argument. So, have you ever gotten feedback that your quotes feel, I don't know, a little disconnected? Like they're just kind of dropped in out of nowhere? It's a super common issue, so don't even worry about it. In this explainer, we are going to fix that for good. You'll be turning those clunky quotes into a smooth, totally convincing argument. So here's our game plan for today. We'll start with the big idea of weaving in sources. Then we'll define our terms, walk through a step-by-step method for introducing a source, cover how to cite it again, look at some common mistakes to avoid, and then we'll finish up with a super handy checklist. Okay, first things first, let's get the big picture here. Your sources, they're there to support your argument, not to make it for you. The real goal is to weave them into what feels like a natural conversation, where you are always the one leading the discussion. Here's a great way to think about it. Your paper is like a dinner party. You wouldn't just have a guest suddenly stand up and start talking out of the blue, would you? Of course not. You'd introduce them first. The exact same rule applies to your sources. You've got to be a good host and introduce them properly before they jump into the conversation. So, before we can properly introduce our guests, we need to know who they are, right? And that means understanding the really crucial difference between primary and secondary sources. The distinction is actually pretty simple. Your primary source is the main event. It's the novel, the poem, or the play that you're analyzing. A secondary source, on the other hand, is any commentary about that main text. Think of it like analysis or criticism that you use to support your own ideas. So what does a secondary source actually look like in the wild? Well, it could be a scholarly article you found in a database, a chapter from a book of literary criticism, or even a solid piece from a reputable website. These are the expert voices you're inviting into your conversation. All right, this is the real core of our explainer. How do you make that perfect, polite first introduction? Don't worry, we're going to break it down into a simple, totally foolproof method. It all boils down to these 3 essential steps. First, you give the author's full name and the title of their work. Second, you briefly summarize their main point, especially how it relates to your argument. And third, you weave in your quote and tack on the proper MLA in-text citation. Let's see it in action. So imagine you're writing a paper and you find this perfect quote from a scholar named Lisa Brown. It says exactly what you need to support your point. But you can't just drop it into your essay like this. You've got to introduce it first. And here is what that looks like in practice. Just notice how all 3 of those steps come together perfectly. We introduce the literary scholar Lisa Brown and her article title. Then we use a little signal phrase, argues that, to summarize her point before we smoothly weave in the quote. And finally, we cap it all off with that MLA citation. It's just seamless. Let's break down exactly why that example is so darn effective. It checks every single box. The reader knows who is speaking, Lisa Brown. They know what her credentials are. She's a literary scholar. They know her main point, and they know exactly where to find the information. You've given that quote all the context it needs to be really powerful. So, you've made your perfect introduction. What happens when you want to use another great quote from Lisa Brown later in your paper? Do you have to introduce her all over again? The answer is nope. Once your guest is at the party, you don't reintroduce them every time they speak, right? For any later citations from Lisa Brown, you just need her last name. See here, the writer connects their own idea about the narrator's prolonged isolation directly to Brown's work, followed by that simple citation. The conversation just keeps flowing. No clunky repetition needed. Knowing the rules is great, but sometimes seeing what not to do can be just as helpful. So let's look at the 2 most common mistakes students make so you can avoid them completely. Okay, the first classic mistake is the dropped quote. It just appears out of thin air and leaves your reader totally confused. The correction, of course, is that smooth introduction we just practiced. By giving that context, you give the quote its power and you show your reader exactly why it matters to your argument. And the second big mistake is reintroducing an author over and over again. It just feels so repetitive and clunky. The corrected version is way more elegant. Remember, after that first full introduction, you've earned the right to simply use the author's last name in your citation. Whew, we have covered a lot of ground. So let's boil it all down into a simple, powerful checklist that you can use for every single paper you write from now on. Okay, here it is. Let's run through it real quick. Number 1. Introduce each source with their full name and title, but only the very first time. Number 2. Always summarize or paraphrase their idea to show how it connects to your argument. Number 3. Use a proper MLA in-text citation every single time. Number 4. Remember, your analysis is the star of the show. And number 5. For all later citations, just use the author's last name. Follow this checklist, and I'm telling you, you'll be weaving sources like a pro. By treating your sources as respected guests in the conversation of your paper, you don't just avoid common mistakes, you actually elevate your own analysis and create a much more persuasive and professional piece of writing. So, are you ready to put this into practice?